Okay. Welcome to this week's engineering colloquium. Please take this opportunity to silence all noise-making devices. Also, when we reach the question and answer portion of our talk, please use the microphones in the aisles, as this talk is being recorded and we want future listeners to be able to hear the questions. Next week, our talk will be New Horizons, A Visit to the Planet That Isn't by the Mission That Shouldn't Have Happened by Mike Reiskowitz. The week after that, our talk will be a look at the Goddard technology that enabled Astro H Hitomi by Peter Sheeran. Our speaker today is Scott Phillips. As a 10-year-old boy inspired by fellow Ohioan Neil Armstrong when he landed on the moon, Scott Phillips dreamed of someday becoming a part of something larger than himself. 10 years later, through a series of serendipitous life events, Scott embarked on a career with NASA's groundbreaking space shuttle program. He was the last team member to exit the first external tank prior to its maiden flight on April 12, 1981, and he saved the Removed Before Flight ribbon as a memento. What followed was an extraordinary 33-year adventure encompassing the entire span of the program, from the depths of tragedy to the exclusive, never-before-seen photos and first-hand stories. Scott Phillips worked on the Space Shuttle program as a logistics engineer supporting all 135 missions. Both woodworking and the Space Shuttle are in his blood. In the late 80s, he was inspired to design and create his one-of-a-kind shuttle models out of exotic hardwoods. To date, he has crafted over 450 models to reflect and honor the excellence and legacy of the shuttle program. Scott recently completed his memoir, Removed Before Flight, which takes the reader on a historical and personal journey that enlightens and entertains. He's an artist, aerospace patent holder, space historian, and space shuttle archivist. He lives in Harvest, Alabama with his wife, Diane, and his sons, Christian and Tyler. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Phillips, starting with a short video.
This Sunday will be the one-year anniversary of the launch of the final Space Shuttle mission. Now, we haven't forgotten the shuttle, and if Madison County Scott Phillips has his way, we never will.
His passion, the shuttle's legacy. And WHNT News 19 Steve Johnson with the story.
You don't really think about spaceflight as you watch Scott Phillips saw a piece of cherry wood. In Scott's workshop, you start getting hints. He takes the cherry and other choice pieces of wood, and he turns them into models of the space shuttle. He made his first one in 1985.
Well, you know, I had a situation where people were retiring from the shuttle program, and I was a woodworker and everyone knew it, and so I was challenged to make a crude representation of the shuttle.
Of course, there's nothing crude about the models Scott has lovingly created since that first effort.
It's a serious thing for me, and I've done over 250 to date, and I have every one of them tracked.
From Scott's workshop, the shuttle models have gone to astronauts, to retiring NASA workers, even to NASA administrators. Scott has kept a few, like this one signed by the pilots of the very first shuttle mission, STS-1. This photo shows Scott's special connection to that first flight. Working for a NASA contractor, he was the last man out of the external tank.
America's first space shuttle.
Yeah, Scott was at Kennedy Space Center for that first shuttle launch, and he worked with the external tank for every launch since.
Liftoff, the final liftoff of Atlantis.
And that includes the last one, nearly a year ago, STS-135.
My father-in-law, he's a World War II guy, 87 years old, flew a B-25 Mitchell. He talks about it like it was his whole life, and he was on it for 16 months. And here I've been in the space program for 33 years, so it's something I'll carry with the rest of my life.
Scott made this tribute to the shuttle program. It includes all the mission pins and, of course, a shuttle model. It's signed by the last crew. The display also includes the red flight ribbon Scott pulled from that very first external tank.
Having fired the imagination of a generation, a ship like no other, its place in history secured, the space shuttle pulls into port for the last time.
Scott retired after that final mission, but there's no separating Scott Phillips from the shuttle program. Certainly the dozens of hours he puts in every exquisite model shows his love for the shuttle's legacy.
I'm excited when I see somebody light up and get one of those models.
The best thing, Scott Phillips plans to keep making them. Steve Johnson, WHNT News 19.
Scott Phillips busy these days writing a book about his experiences with the shuttle program.
Also, there's a display of his work at the Huntsville Convention and Visitors Bureau in Church Street. It will be there through the end of August.
I'm Josh Baer with SpaceAlabama.com. The space shuttle program may be over, but a former shuttle employee is keeping the legacy alive with two different tools, words and wood. Scott Phillips earned his nickname not from working on the actual space shuttle, but from his exquisite models.
Shuttleman was a nickname. They're just because I did the shuttle models, and it just came natural to me. And so it became sort of an identity for me.
He began making the models to commemorate each shuttle mission. He's now made over 450 models, many with over 20 types of wood. The models not only represent shuttle history, but are also a part of it.
John Glenn, Eileen Collins, Mae Jemison, and some of those folks came back, and I got them to sign. So it's really sort of an art that I can pass on to the next generation, because these will be around for quite a few years.
But Phillips wanted to leave behind something more than the models. His new book, Removed Before Flight, is his way of ensuring the spirit of the space shuttle program endures.
I want my boys, in particular, and the next generation, to get that sense of purpose and accomplishment, and then really it helps mankind in the long run.
Wood will eventually decay, but words can live much longer.
I'm really keeping the inspiration, the flame of inspiration burning for human spaceflight through the legacy of the space shuttle program.
Phillips hopes that his models and book help inspire the next generation like he was inspired by former generations himself. For all your space news, visit SpaceAlabama.com.
Hello, Goddard Space Flight Center. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, Lisa, I appreciate that great little change we had to make, but you did great. I appreciate that. Hey, I really appreciate Mark Hubbard. Mark Hubbard for actually recommending me to come to speak to y'all. And as you can tell by my language, I'm actually from Alabama. At the Marshall Space Flight Center. Has anybody been to the Marshall Space Flight Center? Really? Cool. Great. Well, as you know, Marshall Space Flight Center is, of course, the home of Werner von Braun. Of course, the propulsion without Huntsville. We'll take the claim, without Huntsville, we would not have had a propulsion system for the space shuttle program. We were responsible for the external tank, which was the product that I was on. And then we, of course, had the solid rocket boosters and, of course, the SSMEs, the Space Shuttle Main Engine. So it started out for me early in my career. I actually was born in a small town in Ohio. And I won't bore you with all the details, but I actually was born 80 miles north of Wapakoneta, Ohio, and I was 10 years old in 1969. Does anybody know why Wapakoneta is very important? Anybody know where? Neil Armstrong, that's right, he was from Ohio. So I was inspired as a 10-year-old. So it turned out that I wanted to do something larger than myself. And so it was just by a serendipitous opportunity that I had with my family moving around the country that I ended up in Huntsville. So part of the talk I, of course, label is belonging, what it means to belong to the world's greatest workforce. Look to the right and look to the left of each person in here, just if you indulge me. You are part of the world's greatest workforce. And now what you're doing is you're working to change how we look at ourselves. And it makes a difference, folks. We know what's going on out in the world today, but to belong or to be part of the world's greatest workforce, I had the privilege of belonging to the Space Shuttle program, as you saw in the film, 33 years, from its inception of the testing of the external tank to the last final flight of the shuttle program. So I had a situation where I'll get a little bit, what we'll do is, I'm not going to get overly technical. How many people in here know anything about the external tank of the space shuttle? I mean, okay. A lot of people don't know how sophisticated that piece of equipment was. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and throw up the first thing. In 1977, I'm thinking maybe a third of 1977, looking at this group, you were all alive in 77. Maybe not. Okay, Lisa wasn't. Okay. This is history for you. Ancient history, possibly. But for most of us in here, do we remember when the very first space shuttle's external tank rolled out that we made for the program? It was in September of 1977. It rolled out at the Michoud facility, and that tank, when NASA awarded the contract to Martin Marietta, the company that got the contract for the external tank, they directed Martin Marietta to manufacture 3 test vehicles before we did ET-1, or the very first flight tank. The very first tank was called MPTA, and I won't get boring with that, but it was Main Propulsion Test Article. The Main Propulsion Test Article was used to hold propellants for the testing or the certifications of the Space Shuttle main engines, or the SSMEs, in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. We used that tank for 10 years to actually, it was really a run tank for the cluster firing of the SSMEs to certify they were ready to fly. I had the privilege at the age of 19, 20, and 21 to be at the Stennis Space Center. We called it NSTL at the time, but it's called Stennis today, to actually work not only on the exterior of that, but I also worked on the interior. And so that was a very interesting situation, because we had procedures that had been written that had never been used before. Guess what? Did I tell you I was 19? I was a guinea pig. So we took those procedures for the first time, and we had to act those, or had to work those procedures to see if they would actually work. So the history again is the fact that this is the very first tank, and this tank does exist today. Has anybody been to Huntsville at the Space and Rocket Center? Okay, well, okay. You saw the display with the Pathfinder on top of it. That is that tank. We brought that up in 1988 to Huntsville, and we modified it and made it into a display. So that first tank for the program is located in Huntsville, Alabama at the Space and Rocket Center. Next slide, please. Well, I'm not going to get overly technical here. I hope I'm not losing anybody. But, of course, the overall thing of an external tank, and I'll just give you the basic stats, was 154.2 feet in length. Okay, now picture that in your head. And it was almost 28 feet in diameter. And the first tanks that we made for the program were called standard weight tanks. And those tanks weighed 77,000 pounds dry weight. In other words, that's before we put the fuel in it. Those tanks weighed 77,000 pounds. Now, as time went on, of course, we had situations where we had to do stress analysis on some of the first tanks, and we barely really made the first 6 tanks, but we made them work. We had issues with the materials, but we had enough materials, so we went ahead and made the 6 heavyweights, but then we got into a program called the lightweight tank. Did anybody ever hear about the lightweight tank? Okay, the lightweight version of the external tank. So as you see here, of course, you have the hydrogen portion of the tank, and I think I have my little flasher here, but the hydrogen portion of the tank right in here is where I spent a lot of time. We had an access hole down here called a manhole cover, and so we would go in there in a vertical flight configuration. When it was in flight configuration, we would actually traverse inside the external tank, and I was part of that team. We were the only team that did that. So, but we had to find the procedures on how to do that safely without breaching the tanks. And of course, if you're in a confined environment, everybody knows what a confined environment is. So we were in a big confined environment. So here again, this was the dome section here. Of course, that's the aft attached to the orbiter. This was the 17-inch feed line where the LOX, or the liquid oxygen, flowed through. Now, this isn't a test, but how cold is LOX? Did anybody know? Minus 297. Somebody's going to Google that and maybe prove me wrong, but 297 or 293. 297. So we actually ran a LOX through the exterior part of the tank. So that's what always that 17-inch feed line represented, was the actual LOX feeding on this side of the tank. And then we had the what we call the inner tank portion. In other words, this portion here was 22 feet high. And that actually put the hydrogen tank and the LOX. This ogive section here held the LOX tank, or fuel, right here at minus 297. Of course, obviously, we fed the hydrogen on this side and the oxygen on this side. And of course, it went into the orbiter and, of course, fed the 3 main engines. And so that's how that works. So basically, this was a throwaway tank. As you know, we threw the tank away every time it saw what we call combined environments, heat, stress, and it actually, if people stop and think about it, when the solid rocket boosters, there were 2 solid rocket boosters, and when they were side by side on either side of the tank, they weren't timed exactly right. One booster might have gone sooner than the other, but very undetectable to the eye. The external tank, anybody can guess the size of the volume of fuel inside. Does anybody have any kind of a close thinking of how many gallons? Any guesses on how many gallons of fuel? Okay. Well, it was 539,000 gallons of fuel. 539,000. And it consumed, we had some left over, but it consumed 528,616 gallons, and it emptied out in 8 minutes. That's pretty fast. So the tank itself, the first tanks were made of 2219 aluminum, and so we were able to actually weld those, and I actually brought a sample. In fact, Mr. Marco, will get you, maybe we just get Jim over here. Jim, just start this. Everybody heard about the insulation on the shuttle program, on the shuttle tank, where we actually put foam because we're dealing with cryogenics. Now what I'm going to do is offer to you, you see that little knife? Is there a knife there? Okay. I won't look if you want to peel a piece off and put it in your pocket, because that actually came off of ET-138, the last, and don't eat it, by the way. But I brought that along as a memento when we foamed ET-138 for the final thing. So if you feel like you want a little piece of that, go ahead and take some of it off. But that's how light that foam was. It was about 1-inch layer. Also, all the orange part that you see here was all that insulation foam, which was about an inch in thickness. So we were able to insulate all the cryogenic temperatures. Here again, hydrogen. Anybody remember what hydrogen? Not a test, but it's minus 423. So that's pretty cold. So real cold. So we were able to have these two cryogenic tanks joined together by this inner tank. And so, as I was saying earlier about the solid rocket boosters, everybody remember the solid rocket boosters, 3.2 million pounds of thrust on each booster. Of course, it was on either side. And when one booster would go up, the other one might fight, and it would be a seesaw effect, and it would actually, the tank itself weighed initially 77,000 pounds, but with the fuel on board, it weighed 1.6 million pounds. So it acted as a shock absorber, too. And it was not only the backbone for the orbiter to hang on, okay, and not only the fuel tank to propel the SSMEs, give them the fuel that they needed to do the ascend, it also acted as a shock absorber. A lot of people don't know that. So we're talking about quarter-inch aluminum material that actually was all the structure here, and we had some heavier titanium parts, but this whole tank right here absorbed that force of 6 million pounds of thrust. Isn't that staggering? And it came out, it survived. It was just really an unknown piece of equipment that we actually threw away every time. And but we had about 2,800 people at the Michoud facility through the years average. At one time we got up to about 4,000. That was pre-Challenger. We had about 4,800 people that were getting ready to build these tanks 2 at a time every 2 weeks. And the dream was to fly, of course, the shuttle a lot more than what we did. In reality, we were geared up. Of course, then Challenger happened, and then we cut back on the production of the tank, which dropped it down to about 2,500 people is what we were dealing with at that point. So go ahead, hit that next slide there thing. Well, does anybody recognize that tank? That gentleman right over there knows. What is that tank? So what does that tell you? Well, I tell you what, I could tell you how it is the first one. Okay? So you'll know, so everybody else will know. Do you see this ring all the way around it? That'll tell you that that's ET1. Do you know what that ring was? A lot of people don't know. But what it was, and John Young complained about it when they flew it, was echo tape. Echo tape. And that's a little thing that people don't know, is we put echo tape, which actually measured the temperature. And guess what? It burned off, and it smelled really bad. And John Young said, don't do that again, because it was right into their face. So anyhow, so this is ET1. Now, I actually, as you saw in the video, I had the honor and the privilege of actually being the last technician to be removed from the external tank before Bob Crimpin and John Young flew. And this was the tank. So this is what we're looking at, is the LOX tank here. This was down at the Michoud facility before we actually shipped it down to the Kennedy Space Center for a hookup to the Columbia. So this would have been around 1980 at this point, 79, 80. So that is the very first tank. And does anybody want to ask me a question why it's painted white? That gentleman right there, he's wanting me to ask me something.
I think it was for thermal control, but found later to be not necessary.
That's close. That's exactly right. In fact, the white itself on the first shuttle flight and second was FRL, fire retardant latex. And what that was is they were concerned, NASA was concerned that the plume from the SRBs or from the SSMEs, from the Space Shuttle main engines, would ignite the tank and burn the foam off and then, of course, cause all kinds of problems. Well, as it turns out, I actually knew the guy. His name was Dr. Jim Stuckey. He did a test, and he found out that that was not the case. So we saved, of course, you know, when we go into orbit, all you folks know, for every pound you're saving on the ground, as you guys know when you design satellites, is a pound you can carry up in orbit, or materials or whatever, right? So we decided not to paint ET number 3 all the way to the remaining flight tanks, and that's why they were orange, because that was the natural. As you saw the foam going around, that was new, but if you had it in UVs, it would turn orange over a period of time. So, so that's the reason that we didn't do that. So, next slide. Well, I didn't know if you believed me or not, but I actually was in that tank. And can you tell which one, who I am? You pre-beard. But we were actually charged with, we were in a flight configuration, and I had the opportunity to work on probably a very sophisticated team that actually was certified to put this man carrier inside the external tank to actually access every inch of the walls inside of the vehicle. And so we actually had to prove out that we could actually construct this inside through a 36-inch manhole cover. And we put each one of those pieces together, and it's the chapter in my book, I only just tell one facet of it because it was very complex. But we were able to do it. We did have, and I won't give a spoiler, but in the book, I'm going to plug the book a little bit, that we did have a problem. And that was, I almost lost my life. So I'll just leave it at that. So we were proving out the procedures. I was on this contraption here. I was 80 feet up, and we had some problems. And I'm not going to, it's in the book to tell you the result of that. Of course, obviously I'm here today, so it's a happy ending, hopefully. So anyhow, this was a very sophisticated test that we did, and this final test did prove that the external tank was suitable to fly for STS-1. So I take pride in the fact that I had that opportunity to do that. This right here, this tank, there were no cameras allowed in ET-1. So we did this in MPTA. I'm at Stennis with this tool because we had to prove the tool out before we put it in ET-1 at the Kennedy Space Center. So this is actually MPTA. Identical. The only reason there's not a picture of me in there is because they wouldn't allow cameras inside the vehicle. It's FOD, you know, foreign object display. They didn't allow that. So, unfortunately, but this depicts the fact of the complete setup and it was identical actually. So, next slide. We'll go with that. Well, we'll get into, like I say, does anybody have any questions about the technical element of the tank? I mean. Okay, we got.
What were we looking at there besides the man carrier?
Okay.
The previous slide where seems like the tubing and such is not related to just.
Okay, this right here.
Well, the small tubing looks like it's the man carrier, but the larger tubing is something else.
Right. Okay, what this was, and we had a nickname for it. You're very astute. I appreciate that. This structure here was a stainless steel structure. And it was rotating 360, it was on a pivot. And actually, we called it a P-row, like the P-row boat. It was boat-shaped, like a P-row, like an Indian P-row. So we would always say, we got everything together except the P-row isn't up. And everybody started sweating because the P-row weighed 5,000 pounds. And what the P-row did is actually attached to the SRB beam. We actually had a hook right here, and we lifted it 90 feet all the way to the bulkhead of the hydrogen tank inside of an external tank. And we actually had to hook this element up to the SRB beam through the manhole cover. And then that carried our weight. See the wheels on the side? There's the wires that actually held the platform. On either, you can't see it on this side, but on that side. So this P-row would actually rotate 360 degrees, so we could pivot the whole thing 360 degrees all the way around. So does that answer your question? Okay. That was all stainless steel. Man, I'll tell you what, that was, whoo. And that scared the fire out of us when we did. Okay, got the slide here. So I had a desire to interact with the crews, and so I became kind of into a love that I had was carving space shuttle models. And so, as you can see here, Scott Altman, commander. Does anybody remember what last flight he flew? STS-125, that's right. That was the final servicing mission to the Hubble. By the way, I want to thank you guys who were involved in the Hubble program. You've rewritten the books of cosmology, not only for this country, but for the world. Everywhere I go, they know the Hubble telescope. They know the Hubble. They don't know other things, but they know the Hubble. And the American people take ownership to that. And they were disappointed when we canceled the mission after Columbia, but then when Mike Griffin came in and wisely chose to go ahead and fly that mission, of course, I know Goddard got excited and everything else, and it's given us great pictures and everything now. So the way that I contributed to it was I provided these, of course, you see the models and stuff I have over here. So Scott was gracious and through the years signed these models and so on and so forth. So I wanted to just throw that picture. There's Massimino over there, you know, and of course this was the protocol line we had to wait in, so I took vacation time when I needed to make those meetings to get them signed and for future legacy. Next slide. Well, remember me telling you about the MPTA tank, the first tank. Here it is in Huntsville, Alabama. There she is. Yeah, that's actually Sears Weather Beater Brown. Yeah. So that tank was stripped down several times, by the way, too, because we had cycled it so many times, and so on and so forth. So that is the early display that we set up in 1988. So if you go to Huntsville today, you'll see this display, and it's on the Pathfinder. And has anybody seen the display? Has anybody been to Huntsville to see? Okay. So you've seen it. Okay, good. Okay, yeah, good. Okay. Okay, yeah, this happened in 1988. We actually was during Mardi Gras down in New Orleans because it was in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, hanging on the B1, B2 stand for many years because we quit using it. And we actually barged it up to Huntsville, and then we offloaded it. Funny story, it's in my book. Funny story is we actually laid out the route, about 6 mile route where we had to transfer it from Marshall to the Space and Rocket Center where it is today. And we laid everything out scientifically, you know how we all got I'm a logistics guy, so I had to tape measure everything out. We had laid gravel, we did everything to have the transporter. Of course, remember, it's 77,000 pounds. So we get to the final turn to get it in place, and guess what? We hit a tree. We hit a tree. And so the decision had to be made, either lift the tank or get a chainsaw. Guess what we did? We did the chainsaw. There you go. So that's the story. Okay, got the next one. This is, the reason I've got this up here is this is the nose cone. I think most people saw the shuttle 2 minutes prior to launch on the pad. Now, how many people actually have seen a launch in here and live? Oh, jeepers. Okay, great. But we all saw the beanie cap. Does everybody know what the beanie cap is? That's that, yeah, beanie cap, yeah. So this actually here was metal when we started building the first external tanks, and we decided to change over to a composite. After the Challenger disaster, we were concerned about potential FOD, coming down, hitting the windshield of the orbiter. So we implemented a program to replace the metal nose cone we had up there with a composite, and I was instrumental in helping prove that technology along with a great team. We actually built 52 of those cones And we had no failures. They were all successes in a sense of flight. So they really and it shaved 10 pounds off the weight. That's 10 more pounds, 10 more boxes of whatever. So I put this picture up here to kind of show you on its transporter. Of course, it was raining that day, but that was directly my product that I worked with directly every day for several years, and we were very proud of that program. So we actually were first in space in the sense that the meanie cap came off, and that was the first thing to leave the pad. That was our first 2 minutes of fame. So, well, you recognize that guy with the beard. It's legacy time. Long journey. So, of course, the shuttle program ended. And so I decided to take my love for the study of woods and create these one-of-a-kind shuttle models. I have them signed by all the first, John Young, Bob Crimpin, all that thing. So I have a display that I go around. I'm a one-man shuttle with my family. They support me. We homeschool our 2 boys. We have written the book, Removed Before Flight. So we're just really kind of going around to inspire, to remind our generation what was accomplished, but then really to inspire that next generation to work for. You younger generation have some foundation to work off of at this point. Go ahead and flip there's my book. There's one of my shuttles right there. Okay, next. Okay, now. Okay, that's the end of the technical. Does anybody have any question? I'm going to get into the inspirational element. Anybody have any technical? The gentleman back there, if I can hear you.
Yeah, the tanks weren't reused, but were they recovered, or did they just go to the bottom of the ocean?
Yeah, no tank. Of course, early on they were trying to come up with a plan of reutilizing. Now, the tank itself, made out of 2219 aluminum, was really a very one-use type of tank in the sense that the material was about a 1/4 inch thick. We had about 1 inch foam on it. The tanks were not designed to be reused because of the combined environment. In other words, the SRBs used it as sort of a cushion or as a shock absorber to absorb that 1.6 million pounds of just the external tank weight. Just use that as a shock absorber. So the tank was almost probably in a leaking position already when it hit MECO, main engine cutoff, when they jettisoned 8 minutes later. So each tank ended up over the Indian Ocean, and so you're going to have those tanks, at the bottom of the ocean at this point. Yeah. I wish we could have reused them. It would have been a great platform. I have a story in my book that does describe, we try to come up with some ways of reutilizing the external tanks, maybe as a telescope, as a gamma ray imaging. Some of you folks might remember the gamma ray imaging telescope, GRIT. We did that back in the 90s, and we tried to prove the fact that we could take a tank up, put a clean environment back in it, and then have a telescope. But the budget wouldn't allow it, so that program died. So all external tanks are gone as far as flight tanks. Next question. Would that answer your question? Okay, thank you, sir. Oh, you know what? I was hoping that question was going to be asked because there's a misunderstanding. Some people will tell you, now I'm going to tell you the whole thing, is there was actually all the flight tanks were built, right? That's 135 flights, so there's 135 tanks, right? Then we built, did you look this up on Google or something? You're tricking me or something? No, okay, I'm just messing with you. But here's the knowledge, is we actually built the MPTA tank, was a test tank, and we built the GVTA tank to mate up with the Enterprise, and we built the STA, or the static or structural test article. There's another 3. And guess what? There's a tank we didn't use. Does everybody remember what happened after Columbia? We put another tank off to the side, ET-94, and that's on its way out to California. So how many does that add up? That's 139 we built for the program. That answer your question? Look it up. Next question. Yes, sir. Yep. Okay, well, those were explosive bolts, and we had issues. That was one of our, what we call SIL items, critical items. In other words, we actually had what we call bolt catchers. And they were tube-like configurations that were actually housed over the fixturing between the boosters and the tank. I'm not talking about the orbiter. I'm talking about the boosters and tank where the boosters had kickoff. Is that what you're talking about? Well, we were involved post-Columbia on what we call the bolt catchers. And we had some near misses where some of those bolts could have breached the tank, because they were actually ignited, and they were pyrotechnic and blew apart. That's how that happened. So that was a miracle in itself that they all worked as well as they did. But those bolts, the shaft of those bolts, man, they were big. I mean, they were big and heavy. Right. Well, you actually had, I think, control from the cockpit. They had control of that. They did release valves inside. Of course, they had what they call the bipod area, which was the forward element. They were able to detach from the orbiter that way. Those didn't explode because that would have damaged the tiles. So those were mechanical in nature, and they did that from within. And if Scott Altman was here, he could probably tell you, how they did that for sure, on that light. So that's a good question, though. That was a good question.
What kind of a system was that?
Well, it was a complex system. Of course, you had what you call the oxygen side and the hydrogen side. Okay. Now you had. It was rather complex. In fact, I wish I had put a picture of that there, but there was what they call a recirculation line for the hydrogen, where the hydrogen had to recirculate in there. And so we actually had, there was valves involved in releasing, pressure-type valves. We didn't want to use explosives there because here again that would damage the underneath element of the orbiter. And so we had two things on each side, the hydrogen and the oxygen, and those were mechanically done also. And but the vents, I remember being on the test stand when we tested those vents, and boy, it shook the whole stand. I mean, they were violent when they shut down and opened up, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question 100%, but it was mechanically. We did not blow those because that would have damaged the tiles, So that was, So that answered your question enough there to make you okay. Yes, sir. That's the guy I ate lunch with right there. Very friendly man, Jim.
It's a friendly question.
Yes.
Where are the pumps located that put thousands of gallons per minute from the tank to the shuttle engine?
Okay, well, that was in the ground support equipment. In other words, you're talking about filling the tank?
During the you had to pump through the engine. You had to pump huge amounts of fuel.
Okay.
With an impeller?
Okay, on the SSMEs? Well, I mean, in other words, you had to suck that out. Of course, the tank was pressurized. The tank saw 22, it's like an aerosol can. It actually was pressurized to about 20, it's been a while, but 22 to 25 PSI in that tank, forcing that fuel, okay? So you actually, of course, had when the engine spun, it drew its fuel through those lines. I mean, it was demanding the fuel. There was a pump that was actually pumping it out of there. Yeah. Yeah, in the orbiter, that's right. There was, yeah. The SSMEs within the SSME areas, there was that pump that pulled that out. Like I say, it was pressurized. The tank itself was pressurized, and so we had that in there. So does that answer your question? I mean, but the engines actually drew, wanted that fuel there. It needed to have that. So it, yeah. Yes, Mark. Right. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly what those were. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. There was some little additional things, but primarily what you saw is what you got there. Yeah. Yeah. So. Oh, yeah. In fact, when we saw the shuttle, we all saw this beautiful bird go up, and very consistent looking. Every shuttle flight was different. We had different people working on it. We had different materials. We had different configurations. Everything was different about each shuttle. We learned, though, from the previous shuttle flights. It was a learning process, but each flight, as consistent as it looked on TV or as in real life looking at it, each one was different. Those tanks, we changed out vendors, for different materials, and we had all different kinds of differences, that weren't like the other tanks. So no one tank, they looked the same, but the guts were different. They were similar, but they were, yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, even in the versions of the tank, we had 3 versions of the tank. We had a heavyweight version, which was 6 of those tanks. And then we flew what we call the lightweight tank, which was actually 10,000 pounds lighter. We shaved 10,000 pounds off of that heavyweight to make it 66,000. And then if that wasn't bad enough, NASA came back and said, shave another 8,000 off for the International Space Station. So we shaved another 8,000 off of that. And we had to change material in order to do that. We changed over from 2219 to 2195 aluminum lithium. And so that lightened the weight of the tank, but it was hard to weld. So you can just unplug that. Yeah, it has a limit. That's the limit. How many could venture a guess what ET-20 or ET-1 costs? Any guesses? What would you think an ET would cost? How much? Well, I actually own the DD-250. I actually did before we shredded. I kept it. $22 million. The final tank was a super lightweight, $65 million. Because of the material change. So with going with the Russians' plan, see, people didn't really understand that we were going to a Russian inclination for our international station. And so that cost a little bit more distance, and we had to have a lot lighter tank, and we paid for that because we had to buy different materials and all that. So each tank was different. Okay, so that ends for my pushing time here. So here's what I really came for. Belonging or being part of the world's greatest workforce, as you all looked at each other going, yeah, I work here at Goddard. It's cool. But I tell you what, folks, you're building your legacy. So here's what I got out of this. 33 years of working on shuttle, I decided to go ahead and write a book about it, and here's what it turns out. I was inspired in 1969 by, and most of you in here probably were too, inspired by Neil Armstrong's desire to be the first man on the moon, and he was, and we were all enthusiastic. And so I was inspired by that, but I didn't know how I could attach myself to something larger than myself. I didn't know how to do that. I'm a 10-year-old. I'd say, how do I attach myself to something larger than myself? And so I knew this as a 10-year-old. I knew that if I did my schoolwork and I did right by people, in other words, the honesty and the integrity, and if I generated a great work ethic, in other words, doing the right thing at work. So my father serendipitously moved us to Huntsville, Alabama for just serendipitously, and I got involved. It's a long story. It is in the book, but it's entertaining because it was a very serendipitous opportunity that I had. So being prepared. And I would tell this to young folks in particular because us old folks been down that road. So not only was I inspired by the moon landing, not only did I really want to attach myself to something larger in life, not knowing how to really do that, I just said, well, let me prepare myself. Let me do my schoolwork, do the things I need to do. So then when I was presented an opportunity at the age of 19, green as grass, but I love to work with my hands. I had an engineering mind, I think, but I love to work with my hands. And so I seized the opportunity to become the youngest man in the testing program of the Space Shuttle program. Wow. That was awesome. Wow. 12-hour days, 7 days a week, double time, time and a half, and triple time, one time on a holiday. For a 19-year-old, wow. That was a great opportunity. So, then within it, I'm not a minister, but I will say this, and you've read articles that just debunk this, but it's really true. Because I've read articles that say, well, you shouldn't chase your passion. I see this young man right there. He looks so passionate. He's got some passion. Every one of us, and I will defy anything, but every one of us has a desire, an innate need to do the things we love to do. Even the older gentlemen that want to stay out here, staying connected to the very passion that they love, and that's human spaceflight or spaceflight in general. So I actually believe that if you have something that you love to do, if it's singing, dancing, reading, writing, and you're working a regular job, work both of them. Work your regular job so you can actually spend time on your passion and develop that. So, and then also, for me, weather through the tough times. In other words, Challenger was a very tough time for me. We killed 7 astronauts. I'm 27 years old now. My boss flips out, says he can't handle it. So they drop it all on my lap. And what do? Quit or persevere? So for 33 months when the shuttle program was down, I persevered and I became a man at that point in time. I'll just tell you, a 27-year-old man trying to resolve issues with the Rogers Commission with Neil Armstrong. In fact, that was a dream of mine to meet him, and I got a chance to do that. Very historical. So I became a well-seasoned individual by going through the tough times. And we all have those with health issues, with job reversals, with employment, whatever it may be. Find your way through that tough time. And I'm not telling you something you guys don't know, but I'm just reiterating the fact for young folks in particular that may have not heard this before, is the fact that you weather through the tough times, you'll be a much better person. So we did that, and we came back to fly successfully 32 months later from Challenger, and then we flew quite a bit of missions after that. Now, look at failure. No one likes to fail. I don't like to fail. Especially when I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm turning down the wrong street. And I'm like, how do I get around? I failed. No one likes to fail, but failure is our best learning teacher. It can be expensive sometimes, but look at failure as a learning experience. It's not forever. Here again, we had trial and error in the shuttle program. I learned to get through it. I have to tell some stories in the book about, going through those tough times and how I persevered through that and became a better person for that. So not only be inspired, attach yourself to something larger than yourself, be prepared, seize your opportunity, develop your God-given talent, and weather through the tough times. Look at failure as a learning experience. Now, my wife, I got married late in life at 35. I was a workaholic. I loved the shuttle program. I was in the program for 15 years before I even met my wife. I had my children when I was 39 and 40. So I found out about valuing unconditional love, and in this case it would be relationships. You guys spend more time, most of the time, with the people at work than you do at home. Develop that relationship, because that will be there for you after you leave the program or after you retire or whatever. Mark Hubbard has become a new friend to me. I'm an old guy, and I'm not into making new friends, but I actually have a great friend. And Jim, you're a smart guy, and I appreciate you hanging around with me today. So fact is, you can make new friends. So that's what you want to do, is form your relationships here, do right by people, and you'll be all right. Now, exercise patience. What does that mean? And I feel like I'm giving a lecture here, but we all want what we want when we want it. But the reality, there's a story in my book that I reached too far. I wanted it, but I reached too far, and I got burned. Now, I won't give you a spoiler in the book, but it taught me a life's lesson. I had a passion. My passion overruled my sensibility, okay? So exercise patience, do the right thing, get everybody on board, and then there'll be a good idea, okay? In other words, we all want what we want. Say, hey, this idea is a great idea. I'm going to try to get it pushed. But if not everybody's on board, it will fail. It will fail. You have to learn to articulate that message on your ideas, get everybody on board, and once that's done, that'll be probably successful. And then in retirement mode, there's some older guys in here I see, and maybe on the second time of retirement, but I'm a young guy, and I retired early because my brother had lung cancer in his life, and he passed away a couple years ago, but I wanted to spend that time with him, so I was at 33 years. I decided when the shuttle program ended, I wanted to spend time with him. I did. I'm glad I did. But I invested in myself by taking 3 years to write the book to inspire the next generation to reach further than what we did. The shuttle program, the shuttle itself was the most complex vehicle devised by man, and guess what? It still holds that title. And to be associated with the world's greatest workforce like you are here at Webb, with the Webb telescope, I'm very honored and privileged to be around the folks that have anything to do with that, because you guys are really changing the world. And I'm very, very excited to be here, and it's just a wonderful place to be, to learn about. And then the days come when we want to be inspirational to people. In other words, our legacy, a lot of the older folks and young folks need to know this, and I'm not lecturing, but I'm just saying that I've learned that when you have a sealed legacy by working on something so great as a Hubble telescope or the Webb, that you feel there's so much more in your life as a future as opposed to the past. Now, I had 33 years in with the shuttle program. Everybody that came off the shuttle program, half the people didn't really do too well because they put all their eggs in that basket. They didn't really realize that the legacy has become larger than themselves. So I discovered through my shuttle work, through this, talking in my book, that the legacy of the shuttle program is much larger than anything I ever could have done. So this is a card. I believe everybody have one. Everybody hold up. They got your card. That here again, it's a replica or an artifact of actually the ribbon I did pull before Bob Crippen and John Young did fly. So it has the serial number on it. So it is actually a replica or the actual ribbon, copy of the actual ribbon. And I own that ribbon. It's on the tribute. When you leave, you'll see the tribute up there that I built for the end of the program. So I think with that, anybody have any questions? Or you just want to boot me out of here? All right. Okay.
Just to remind everyone, please use the microphones when asking your questions so later watchers can hear. I wanted to start with a question. You mentioned the Challenger disaster. How did that change the attitude or the outlook of the people you worked with?
How did it change the people?
Or how did their attitude change? Because that was the first major failure of the shuttle program, right, and it had to deal with your hardware.
Well, certainly you had a lot of the older guys that had gone to the moon, and so a lot of those guys were there to start. My experience was it was really devastating, initially, because obviously that's the first time we've ever lost an American astronaut while in orbit, in a sense of going into a craft other than Apollo 1, of course, that was on the ground. That was a test. So this was really a wake-up call to the dream. The shuttle was slated to fly, in the beginning, 400 missions a year. Or not 400, 400 over its lifetime. In other words, we were going to fly one every 2 weeks. That was the plan. And the Challenger, of course, we were at rate tooling. I was actually, and the story's in the book, and I know you're talking about the personal element, but we were actually getting ready to sign a contract for $1.6 billion to build 2 tanks with 5,000 people. And once that Challenger happened, we had to lay off half of those people. So you're right. That really changed the way we looked at the shuttle system as a space truck, that was going to be an easy access, when it really turned out to be a very complex but capable vehicle. And a lot of people did lose their employment, after that. So yeah, that was a negative. But we came back to fly, and we had a lot of accomplishments, certainly with the Hubble, bringing the Hubble, and of course the International Space Station. Of course, I buoyed, the program a little bit more. And then we had the super lightweight tank that we did to build the International Station. So it kind of came full circle. We were really down in the dumps, with Challenger. But for me, it was a beginning because I started to learn, how complex that vehicle was and how to dedicate my life, really to do the right things. And so it was very complex. Does that kind of answer your question? All right. Anybody? Okay, all right.
Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned that a lot of structural analysis were done on the tanks.
Yes.
Was any analysis done? First of all, I presume that the fishermen and such in the Indian Ocean were warned.
Yeah,
That something was coming, and
Yeah,
we couldn't
well,
predict precisely where it would come.
Yeah.
Did we do anything to analyze? Did they break up on impact? Were they already broken up because of the separation? Did any float for a while?
In fact, I thought I had a picture. The tank here again, initially the first tanks had what they call a range safety, and we actually released the ullage, or the remaining portion of the fuel, sort of like an aerosol can, to tumble it, to help it heat up and then to break up. We quit doing that over a period of time. It naturally decayed. Now, we had some heavy parts, like the titanium parts that held through the SRBs, and the 2058 ring frame that actually was the aft portion, did make it through the atmosphere and is at the bottom of the ocean. The nose cones and all that stuff pretty well probably disintegrated. So a lot of that 2219, 2195 aluminum pretty well disintegrated. But there are some heavy pieces, cabling, cable wire and stuff like that down there. Yeah. Good question. All right. Hey, I think we're probably going to wrap her up. All right. I'm headed back to Huntsville. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. My wife is out back. I got her books out there if you need them.